Hey everyone, welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. As always, my name is Mark Vigliotti. I'm the editor-in-chief here. I'm joined by our publisher and our co-host, Brian Storseth. Today we have three terrific guests, as we always do. We have iPolitics major projects reporter Aya Dufour. From Navigator, we have Sharan Kaur. And from StrategyCorp, we have Garry Keller. Both Sharan and Garry are veteran politicos. And of course, Aya is on top of all things major projects for us. So we have a lot to go through. I say this every week because it never is not true. But let's go back to Friday. The big news was the meltdown at the White House. Donald Trump faces really, you could argue, his first setback at the Supreme Court, a court that has basically inoculated him from criminal prosecution in 2004, and now it is taking or made a decision, that basically stopped him from imposing those IEEPA tariffs. Donald Trump responded saying, "Okay, I'll find a different route to do that." It's imposing a new 15% global tariff. Once again, Canada will mostly be shielded from that new tariff because of the CUSMA exemption that they're keeping in place. A lot of excitement, a lot of theatrics, as you expect with Donald Trump. But Brian, I'll start with you. Has anything really, really changed for Canada based on what we saw on Friday?
Well, I mean, with the fact that the CUSMA exemptions are still in place, it had a more limited impact. Plus, I mean, there's a lot of expectation on what the president will do, whether he'll veto and not coming out of it. So I think it was a great symbolic win for sure. I'm not sure the real world impacts of this haven't really played out, I wouldn't say.
And Sharan, what do you make of that? I mean, this isn't like, the 15% tariff, the fact that it's supposed to go into effect, I think, or has already gone into effect, depending on when this airs. It's not the first time that, Trump has responded in this way, very like an emotional, you could say impulsive reaction, but, sometimes he walks those things back. Remember when that anti-tariff ad that Ontario put out, he was all angry, and then he was going to impose an additional tariff that never came together. So should we make a lot of from what Trump is saying in this latest tirade, or are we just going to wait him out and eventually he'll move on to something else?
Listen, everything Donald Trump says and does is based on an emotional reaction, right? Like if anyone who watched that press conference, which by now we're used to these super unhinged press conferences where it's all emotions, but also just a lot of rambling and stuff that we would never see in any other time of our lives with politicians. But I think what we saw come out of there for Canada, at least, was validation that the fact that these tariffs were unjustified. Like, there we go, we have that. But then you add on like the upcoming midterm elections and all these together, and it could mean something. And I think right now, what I tell people and clients all the time is don't react. Like, don't react in a way that, like, don't change your business model. Don't change your, you can't, because you'll basically be doing that every single day. The key here is to wait it out a bit, right? And this gives us a bit more time. So, and I think Prime Minister Carney did not come out with like some sort of big visceral reaction or press conference because he wants that. He wants these reactions so that he can further say, I'm going to tariff you on this, I'm going to tariff you on that. I think it was a positive moment for sure, but it's not going to stop him from trying to come back at Canada in another way. He's already said he's looking at other measures and they've been expecting this. So I think it was validation for a lot of people, and he tried to play it off like he wasn't a loser in this case. But when you continuously start to criticize the institutions that are basically the foundation of everything, you just lose more credibility. And I think at the time of that presser, his approval rating was at like 36 or 38%. So it's not going perfectly great for Donald Trump, but he's still the leader of the most powerful country in the world. So it's still going to have consequences on us.
I mean, that's a good point, Sharan. What do you think, Harry? Do you think the response that Canada, or even just, Prime Minister Mark Carney, the approach he needs to have when Donald Trump's having one of these meltdowns, which I doubt that this is the last one, is to like maybe let the guy like exhale and just like maybe not provide that counter punch that Sharon's talking about that allows Donald Trump to say, oh, okay, you keep talking, I'm going to slap you with something else.
Well, I was actually expecting a greater outburst from Donald Trump, a more emotional outburst than actually that happened on Friday. I thought in some ways he was muted Trump compared to some of the more radical things he said in the past. And it's true. This was really the first big loss that the Supreme Court has handed him on a substantial part of his policy initiatives since he's become president. To the points already made, because of the nature of the IEEPA tariffs, they don't affect Canada as much as they do affect other countries in the grand scheme of things. The new set of tariffs that he's putting in under Section 122, really, they expire after 150 days unless Congress votes to carry them on. So, that takes us into August when those things expire, which is right in the middle of midterm season. So that's the interesting thing I'm looking at. How does that narrative impact midterm season? And again, because this set of tariffs didn't impact Canada as much as it did other countries, it would have behooved Mark Carney to go out and say something stronger. In fact, no matter who the prime minister was, it didn't have any benefit to go out and do something because of the limited impact. Why would you risk that position? So, I think for Canada, really where the focus goes is dealing with the CUSMA review, the discussions around that, the discussions about whether or not Trump tries to hive off Canada and Mexico separately. That is a huge risk in my opinion. And they've done it before, right? Mexico and the United States had a deal basically in the renegotiation the first time around. It wouldn't surprise me. Jameson Greer was there, the USTR. He was chief of staff to Robert Lighthizer. Wouldn't surprise me if they went down that road again. So that's what I'm really looking at, especially for clients, is that is the big risk here going forward.
No, that's a good point. And we also know that I know it was a bit of a symbolic loss, but Trump did lose a vote on tariffs in the House of Representatives when it came to those tariffs on Canada. I think it was 3 or 4, maybe even 5 Republican representatives voted against them. Aya, as we kind of, to Garry's point, as we kind of digest what happened on Friday and look ahead to CUSMA, is there any, I guess, real kind of movement that we've seen? I mean, I know you and I have been kind of following in the background, maybe, the discussion, the appointment of a new ambassador, the appointment of a new, a negotiator, but it does seem like we're still kind of taking these feeling out steps when it comes to CUSMA negotiations. I know they're not starting tomorrow, so it's not like the government has to kind of lay out or whatever lay out their strategy, but it just seems like we're still very, very early stages when it comes to talking about this.
Yeah, early stages. And then we also have the sectoral tariffs still in place. Those are the ones that really hurt. And like Garry said, I'm also really concerned about the US trying to strike maybe a bilateral deal individually with Mexico and Canada. I also think that's a really big risk. We heard Prime Minister Mark Carney talk about this in his Davos speech. When you negotiate with a country that's more powerful than you on a one-on-one basis, the outcome is less favorable for you automatically. And that would make sense, as Garry says, that would be the strategy that Trump administration would pursue ahead of CUSMA renegotiations. So that's definitely something that I'll be watching out for as well.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to shift gears back to the chaos we saw here in Canada last week. Mark Carney is a new MP. Edmonton's own Matt Jeneroux. I was asked about it, whether it was surprising or not. And the way I framed it was yes and no. It was Matt Jeneroux was the rumored, it was the most, well-known rumored potential for Florida crosser for the past few months. But the timing was definitely came out of left field. We heard some rumblings that those conversations had restarted, but I guess we didn't really kind of know how far they progressed. Garry, I want to start with you. How bad of a week did Pierre have last week? And is this something that is going to really threaten his leadership of that party, considering how he's down 3 MPs?
Well, I think it would have had more negative impact had it not been Matt Jeneroux, because Matt Jeneroux was literally spotted hanging out with Liberal PMO operatives back in November, negotiating his way out of the Conservative caucus until he didn't. He decided to spend, quote unquote, more time with his family, and then I guess got to February and said, nah, forget it. I've had enough time with my family. I'm going to go cross the floor. In some ways, given who it was, it perhaps maybe wasn't as surprising. It had been somebody that was unexpected, like Michael Maw around the time of the Christmas party. Infamous Christmas party. But look, you have to take these things seriously when people are leaving the caucus. People are going to be angry about it. They're going to take these things personally. They need to get it out of their system quickly and move on, because it does no good to continue litigating these things in public. He's gone. He ain't coming back. And you really have to focus on moving forward. So again, had it been somebody else, I think it would have been more damaging. I think it just, in a lot of ways confirmed a lot of what Canadians are feeling about politicians and their self-interest when they say they're going to do one thing and do exactly the opposite. And the last thing I would just say is, when Matt decided to say he was not going to vote or be engaged, he was going to go donate his salary since November to charities in the Edmonton area. And I just wonder if he's actually followed through with that or broken that promise as well to his constituents.
What do you think, Sharan? Do you think that this is something that's going to really undermine Pierre's leadership, or to Garry's point, is it something that was expected and as a result it kind of dulls the impact of the move?
I think it's a bit of both. Listen, there was conversations and all of this was kind of rumbling in the fall, and we saw this with the other twos who crossed the floor as well. Listen, nobody loves, regardless which party you're in, no one loves a floor crosser, or at least they don't love the idea of what it does to their own party. There's been, I think, over 300 floor crossings since Confederation. This is not new. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen. And they can happen for a variety of different reasons. In this case specifically, I do think it's a bit detrimental. It just, to a certain extent, people who know, I know Matt Jeneroux, he's a very moderate individual in terms of what he believes in. He doesn't fit into the Poilievre bubble necessarily. And Pierre's created a very big tent, right? He's kind of made it very clear. He's increased his tent. He's made it bigger, kind of is trying to appease to different voters. And we saw that with how many additional votes he did get in the election. So there's no doubt about that. That all being said, it's kind of that drip effect, right? So when we had d'Entremont and then we had Ma, I think what's the most tragic and consequential issue to the Conservative Party is how you respond to it, right? We saw very clearly that it was kind of this coordinated messaging around betrayal, right? He's betrayed his voters and questions around salary donation. That's all fair. When you go out there as a politician and you say, I'm going to do it, it's fair for people to have that question. And I think that's something that you should be able to answer. But all this being said, Jeneroux, as a Conservative candidate, won that election by 30,000 and change in votes. There's 85,000 eligible voters in his riding. The Liberal, who came in second place, came in with 27,000 and change. But I think the messaging is flawed. And I saw Andrew Scheer posted something similar to this, I think 2 days ago. It's, again, going back to this betrayal of people who elected him, betrayal of people who voted. And sure, people can say that. You can feel that level of betrayal, whatever. But there's also more. You don't just represent the people who vote for you, right? You represent everyone. And people can change their minds. We've seen Prime Minister Carney, for example, who was criticized heavily when he came in for some of his own beliefs around things he has said in his book. But you have to meet the moment, right? You have to meet the moment. And when your country is facing a full-on frontal assault by the US, you have to pivot. You have to pivot in what you can do is best for the country. And I think that also applies to candidates and elected officials, that if a party no longer represents what you stand for and is not serving the best interest of what you believe, I think floor crossing is their prerogative. And at the end of the day, the next election, the voters will have their ability to vote who the next member is. I just don't think it's helpful to the Conservatives to attack. Like, the attacks have been visceral. They've been pretty vile. We saw this with Michael Ma too. Like, it was a weird attack over Christmas where they're like, we sent him a Amazon Fire Stick and I want that back. Right. And it's just like,
well, come on, that was a little bit more tongue in cheek. That was a bit of a joke.
It's just like, it's just kind of this whole get over it and move on, right? Like, just move on.
You do.
It doesn't help you.
You have to get over it. And to your point, Sharan, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who the floor crosser is, what party they're with. The next election, if they run again, they're going to have to answer to their constituents, and that's the big test.
Exactly. But again, no one loves it. Like, no one loves a floor crosser. But when the Trudeau government was in place, Leona Alslev crossed over to the opposition, and they welcomed her with open arms. So it's just, to me, the whole line of attack of this is a betrayal. What does he stand for? It's just like, guys, get over it. Like, move on. There's going to be more.
Liberals have that same reaction too. Let's be honest. Liberals have that same reaction too.
Not as visceral.
Come on. Let's not revisionist history here.
I think you guys are both right in this, but I think it comes down to politicians are going to do what's in the best interest of politicians. If Matt Jeneroux says he's running again in that seat, it would be an interesting statement on whether or not he believes he can win in that seat as a Liberal. Would be very interesting to know. But I think the really interesting part of this is floor crossing has happened, and it is a tool that is often used to be disruptive to the other side. I can't remember the last time. I'm sure it has happened, and Garry and Sharan are smarter than I am, so maybe they could inform us. But I can't remember the last time this happened as a tool to gain a majority government. And that's an interesting way to look at it. And does it mean that with these crossings, the Prime Minister isn't looking to go to an election anytime soon, which wouldn't be good for Canadians, wouldn't be good for the economy, wouldn't be good for the major projects. So, at the end of the day, the floor crossing itself, it was the most telegraphed floor crossing in the history of floor crossings when he bumbled it 4 months ago and did it now. I think there's a lot being made of it. But the interesting conversation I think that would be had around it is, does this mean that there's no election speculation for the next couple of years and Prime Minister Carney's happy to govern for the time being?
I think the reaction, though, of the day to Sharon's point, though, might be Rick Perkins criticizing Matt Jeneroux for not living in his riding, forgetting, of course, that Pierre was a parachute candidate. Things happen, in the heat of the moment.
And will be again. He will be again, guys. Where's he going to run, Garry?
So yeah, maybe we should think before we type sometimes. I'm guilty of that too. We were just talking about this. Matt Jeneroux also has a new position, a new, let's be honest, kind of a made up title. We were having a bit of a conversation about, does he go to the PM on his next big trip to Europe? Is that, and we were also having a bit of discussion, like, is this a way to kind of like entice people over? Like, you're not going to give them necessarily cabinet spots, but do you make up titles for them? Like Michael Ma, of course, went on that trip to China, even though it seemed like the government was kind of, going over itself to explain why he would be useful.
Absolutely. As rumors of a fourth floor crossing and what that might mean for a majority mandate come on, I feel like if there was another floor crosser, whoever it is would have a bit of leverage right now to land a good position, because they, would help tip the balance to the favor of the Liberals. So it might be even something better than special advisor. Who knows?
Can you get better than special advisor?
Like, come on, it's made up. It's a fake thing, right?
Just make me the supreme leader guy.
It's not the only time when Wajid Khan crossed from the Liberals to the Conservatives, he became special advisor in the middle. It's made up. It's a fake thing. And if you're going to be that cheap of a date to cross the floor for a trip to a business class trip to India or China or whatever it is, that says a lot more about you than it says about the party asking you across the floor.
Australia, kind of with you.
That's a big trip, to Aya's point.
Well, Garry, we knew that Wajid sold way too cheap when he ended up sitting beside me in the fourth row.
You guys haven't if you've flown in a government plane, guys, this is not like a first class good experience. I always made when we traveled with the government plane, I made it a goal to make our itinerary so we didn't fly on those planes. It is not comfortable.
I may have done that once or twice as well.
Matt, be careful what you wish for. But, one thing, speaking on the Jeneroux front, a conversation we actually had on last week's podcast was, before we knew that Jeneroux was making the move, was discussion around Alberta. And Brian, I'm going to go to you because you're, our resident Albertan here at iPolitics. A new poll from Main Street Research has the Conservatives down to, I think, a 4-point lead in the province. Jeneroux clearly likes his odds. I guess we don't know necessarily if he's committing to running for re-election there, but it definitely does seem to be, there's some signals that, maybe the ground's been shifting in that province. Like, are the Liberals finally in play in Alberta, or is this all just way too early speculation in a poll that maybe is an outlier when it comes to what actually happens on election day?
I've got great respect for the pollsters, so I won't dump on it too hard, but I will take that wager all day long on Conservatives and Liberals in Alberta being 4 points difference come the next election. Has Prime Minister Carney done a good job in reaching out to the province? And I'm happy to see it, because I think there's larger things at play here, such as sovereignty and making sure that people in my former province understand that the government of Canada isn't going to harmful economic policies, continue to enact harmful economic policies on them. I think that's all great. Is Mark Carney going through a bit of a bump? Yes, there's no way that they're that close. Edmonton is the Liberal city for the most part, but the number, like the projections in Airdrie, it's certainly I would question the poll until I see several more that back that up.
What about you, Garry? I was talking to Brian in the run-up to this 2023 provincial election. I spent some time in Calgary going to some of these suburban ridings that were surprisingly in play. And I think the NDP did very well there. But also, this would be a massive upheaval. I looked the last time I think the Liberals won more than 4 seats in Alberta was when when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister. So is there any reason to believe that the Liberals actually have a chance at maybe winning a lot more seats in this province?
I think this poll is a huge outlier. To Brian's point, I won't comment on the pollsters' methodology. I did see Angus Reid post some comments about the technology used. But again, to Brian's point, Parkland, a riding that I grew up in and was born and raised in, which went 75% blue in 2025, is now being classified as a solid red riding. Like, come on, that is not happening. in that riding. Look, Alberta is a very different place than it was, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, of course, with net inflows of people from across Canada and around the world. Of course, it's not the same place that it once was. Yet, it still does vote, despite the provincial two-horse race, it still has voted, even in Edmonton, almost unilaterally conservative. So I would want to see a lot more polling happen come forward. Yes, are people open to Mark Carney's approach, especially, I would say, in the Calgary business community? Yes, they are. That is very true. But until it actually shows results, this is the same province that still has Danielle Smith holding a majority government. So let's be a little cautious about this one poll.
And that's true. But Sharan, the Liberals, even if they win 4 to 5 seats in Alberta, maybe not like what this poll is projecting, isn't that like enough for them to necessarily be knocking on the door of a majority? Like maybe the Liberals, even if this poll is an outlier, the fact that they're making some significant strides in Alberta is enough to, I guess, turn some heads, because it's not like they're that far away from a majority right now.
Yeah, see, Alberta's a weird one, because how do you go from let's separate to like kind of holding hands and like baking cookies together, right? Like you have to really look at the issues on the ground. And from my experience, a lot of this is tied into what is Ottawa going to do for Alberta. I remember back when I was in government and there was conversations around what are we going to do with the TMX pipeline. I very clearly remember being in Alberta with Minister Morneau at the time, and this was before a decision was made, and the level of disgust towards Ottawa was like there. It was in your face. You're getting yelled at. We had to have security. There was protests. It was real. These are people's livelihoods, right? So people are very connected to what are you going to do from us? They feel like, and they do. Alberta puts a lot into Canada as a province and what they do with equalization and everything. But I kid you not, 2 weeks later, once we approved the pipeline, had a sold out speech at the Stampede grounds. The minister was getting high fives at the airport from guys wearing Bass Pro Mills hats, the same guys who probably had come and like decked him the week before that because they were so angry. So I've seen the temperature shift so quickly, right? Like it goes from hot to cold. And listen, this one poll is an outlier. That being said, we also have seen a big shift in Danielle Smith and how she's approached Ottawa. We went from a period of time where her and Trudeau just did not. They were not getting along, and rightfully to a certain extent, because a lot of what Trudeau would say was a bit virtuous in demonizing the sector out there, despite being pro TMX. And we haven't seen that with Danielle Smith, and she's toned it down. Despite all this talk about referendums and all these things, we've seen that relationship shift. And I think it does matter, your tone, your tenor, the desire to help the sector get product to market is a big, big factor. And I think that alone, seeing things get done, seeing pipelines get built, major projects, that actually could shift how that province votes.
Yeah,
I think that's
Garry also
Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
beat an Albertan. I'll give him some time on this, but I do have to say, first of all, credit where credit is due. I know that the former government did build a pipeline that was very important to the economy of the people of Alberta. But the only thing I would say is fundamentally, this is why I think the Liberals are a long ways off in Alberta, because the question isn't what Albertans aren't asking what Ottawa will do for them. Really, the question is, will Ottawa leave them alone, stop overregulating their industries, stop raping and pillaging their resources, and Albertans are about liberty more than they're about a fundamental conservative. Like, I see far more fundamental conservatives in rural Ontario in a lot of places than I ever did in my riding in rural Alberta, where they really want to be left alone to pursue their jobs, abide by the laws, and live a good life.
Brian, isn't that kind of what Sharon's saying, in that, and I'll get Garry to weigh in too, that if you are showing an openness to the energy sector, then some of these harsh partisan divides maybe won't matter to the average voter in Calgary. And the thing that was really making them so strongly pro-conservative was the fact that you had a government that many could argue was very hostile to the resource sector. So if you have someone who's a Liberal government that is, hey, yeah, let's get this project done, that does radically change the dynamic in Alberta.
But it's not about, and I'll let Garry answer, but it's not just about one project.
Exactly. It's not just about one project. It's okay, you got one thing done. Good for you. But here's a list of 87 other things we want you to get the heck out of our lives. Danielle Smith talks about the 9 bad laws and, the variety of regulations and the No More Pipelines law and all these sorts of things that haven't actually been repealed. So there's, Alberta is somewhat a little bit like Missouri, the show me state, right? Like show me that you're actually serious about this. You'll get rid of these 9 laws. No, you're doing it to keep, Ontario and Quebec happy at Alberta's expense. Back to the usual thing. The one thing I will say about Mark Carney that he brings to the table that no one in a leadership position, a serious leadership position in the prior 10 years actually brought to the table is, Mark Carney grew up in and around Edmonton. He will not be unfamiliar to the types of alienation issues that when he was a young man are still prevalent today around Western alienation that no one else really, certainly in the Trudeau government actually understood because they did not come from that lived experience. So even his dad ran as a Liberal candidate in, was it the 1980 election? Lost, of course, but he would have, I'm sure heard the tales from his dad at the doors about the kind of anger that people had around energy policy, and specifically the national energy policy. And that leaves an impact on people. I got involved in politics because we would have these same debates around the dinner table at night, around the national energy policy and official bilingualism. My family and we would read Alberta Report and have these conversations and Time Magazine and Maclean's and have these existential conversations about what Canada means. And so he does at least have that muscle memory. If not, he hasn't even lived there in a long time. He will not be unfamiliar to the issues that Albertans continue to raise. That is different than any other Liberal really in recent memory.
But what about what Danielle Smith is talking about? Like, is that the fact that she's putting forward these referendum questions around immigration, is that something that's really touching on concerns Alberta's facing? Because Brian, I know, I obviously, between you and Garry, you guys have much more experience living in Alberta. I was only there for a year, but I was surprised. I certainly never experienced any or encountered people with really strongly xenophobic views. I thought everyone I met in Calgary, they were seemingly very similar to the people I knew in Ottawa. So is that something that is actually of concern there for people in Alberta, that they want Ottawa to get out of the way when it comes to immigration law? Or is Danielle Smith trying to make a wedge issue here?
Well, I think it's good politics for Danielle Smith right now. And I think it is dangerous because it is inevitably playing off of some negative, very negative things in our society that I don't think politicians should be working off of. But the reality, the economic reality of it, and I've talked to some of the people in government, and they're feeling immense pressure, just as the Ford government's feeling immense pressure from immigration numbers that are a little out of control over the last number of years. Like in Ontario, when you're having to replace the city of London every single year, that's a lot of hospitals, schools, infrastructure that have to be built. And so I do think there's an economic argument she's making there. But every province, Alberta's going through this, Quebec went through it. Every province that goes through these sovereignty issues, as they have a national government that's, I will give the Carney government credit. They do seem to be engaged and concerned about Alberta separatism. But at the end of the day, the provincial government's always going to ask for more levers, and immigration's one of the top ones there.
And I was going to say, Garry talks about how Mark Carney would know intimately the issues or understand that Western alienation. But we saw Carney make a pretty big misstep when it came to Quebec. I'm talking about the Plains of Abraham, seemingly not understanding that province's fundamental political DNA. So I guess I'm just wondering, considering, if Mark Carney is really making inroads in Alberta by taking this approach, does he run the risk of losing some steam in some places where there is maybe not hostility to the resource sector, but definitely a totally different political culture that, especially in Quebec, he seems to be not as familiar with when it comes to other parts of the country?
Yeah, I wonder about that. I haven't seen polling numbers on whether the Quebec speech changed appetite for Carney in Quebec. So I'm not sure, but I do wonder, and I hear what Garry and Sharan are saying about, this pipeline deal helped Carney. It's just one project, though. There's regulations in play that are bigger issues. But in my view, Alberta has scored major points this year, right? Like EV mandate dropped, emissions cap dropped, methane regulations extension, clean electricity regulations carved out. And now really the only thing that's remaining is carbon pricing that's being negotiated right now. And I know I hear from oil producers that they say putting a price on carbon is going to make our industry less competitive. I get that. But there has to be some kind of strategy in place to reduce emissions. Like at this point, we're not even on track to meet 2050 targets. So what is it? We're going to have to wait till we're 2 degrees warmer on this planet before we take this seriously. It's like something's got to give. And carbon pricing is, the policy of choice that Carney has picked. But if it doesn't deliver on results, I cannot see how that's not going to hurt him in Quebec, where, there's a government there that's, putting a lot of effort into climate policy and a lot of pride in meeting climate emissions goals. So I can't see how that's not going to lead to a big fracture.
It does seem like the only Albertan who's not winning right now is Connor McDavid. Too soon. Speaking of which, we had, of course, the Olympics wrapped up on Sunday. We had, I think, our lowest medal haul since 2002. The COC had a interesting press conference on the last weekend talking about what they see as chronic underfunding of sports in Canada, saying that, it hasn't increased since 2005. Of course, we all remember Vancouver, the kind of success we had winning the gold medal haul. And then, of course, in 2018, we had our best ever performance, nearly 30 medals. It is interesting that we're having a conversation around funding for sport, considering that the Olympics, I think, always galvanizes the world's attention. Both, I know Brian, Sharan, and Garry, you guys have all been in governments. So I'm just very curious, I know right now we're talking about this, but are we actually going to have a conversation about funding for sport in this country? Or now that the Olympics are over, are we all going to get back to our lives and just kind of maybe dismiss this as not something that is really that important to Canadians?
Who's that going to?
Whoever wants to take that one.
Here, I'll jump in onto that. Do I think it's going to be on the forefront once this is all done? Not necessarily. I think there's so many things that are so important right now, from managing, again, a trade war, a cost of living, immigration issues. There's so many things. If I was to look at where does sports fall on that scale, I can't see it being the top 5 or even 10 priorities. That being said, we do have advocates in government who are extremely passionate about sports. You've got Adam Vancouverton, a former Olympian himself, who cares deeply about this file. And I think he will, and he's always been an advocate, and he always will be an advocate. I think we have to be able to do 2 things at once. We have to be able to walk and chew gum. So if there needs to be a conversation about funding for sports, let's have that conversation. But is that what, are they going to sit up in the House of Commons and blame federal funding for the lack of medals? No, I don't think. I know there's some politicians who've come out and said, the last time we got medals, Stephen Harper was in government. I'm like, oh God, come on. Let's cut the crap.
Gary, are you making that case right now that if we have a conservative government, we'll get a double gold in the next
2 gold men's hockey medals when Stephen Harper was prime minister? That's all I'm saying. But no. Look, if you're going to have the debate, now is the time to have it, right? When it's still fresh in people's minds and there might be actual argument. And it's not, 3 years from now is not the time to have this debate because it'll be out of people's minds. But, it is a real debate. This stuff costs money. And, by my wife, by chance, just happened to be in Cortina for watching some of the Olympic events and had dinner one night and was sitting next to the president of a sports association, one of the Olympic sports. And basically they're recruiting because of a lack of facilities. One facility has been shut down. The other facility is located in Whistler. It's not easy to get to. It's expensive to house, young athletes in Whistler, BC, near Whistler, British Columbia. So they get the majority of their early talent through the RBC training ground program, right? They just bring a bunch of people in and see if they can make it. I'm not sure that is also the best method either for trying to train high efficiency athletes. We've seen the stories about the Canadian bobsleigh team that we buy our sleds secondhand from the Germans who have BMW and Porsche who are helping design their sleds. So if we're going to have that discussion, we have to take those things in mind. That costs real money to be a bobsled powerhouse. Do we want to be a bobsled powerhouse, or do we want to spend that money elsewhere? But again, I think the main thing is if we're going to have the conversation, now is the time to have that conversation rather than down the road in the future.
And if I can jump in on this, I think there's other ways than government funding. I think the government could put in regulations that would bring in revenue streams. And this idea of redirecting the money that's being made off of sports betting to Olympic groups, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially that it's a growing thing and it's already been, somewhat regulated by the Canadian government. So I feel like there's an opportunity there to sort of recapture some of that revenue and invest it in athletes. Those venues could be explored as opposed to, going for the taxpayer money.
I think we need to fix whatever's going on in Quebec. I don't understand why we don't have any good Canadian goalies coming out of Quebec anymore. That is That was my whole understanding why it was part of the country. But nonetheless, I did want to talk briefly about the situation in Mexico as well. I was just on the Hill, and Anita and Ann was talking about how the situation seems to be improving. Flights are starting again. Considering that obviously we don't share a border in Mexico in the same way that the U.S. does, but it's a top destination for so many Canadians to travel to. How concerning is it? And I'll give this to anyone who wants to take a shot. Is what we've seen in Mexico, considering not only the two country our relationships. Obviously, we have a free trade deal in place, but also we're supposed to be jointly co-hosting a pretty big major event later this year with Mexico.
Yeah. It's very interesting that they decided to strike on one of the most powerful leaders of organized crime in Mexico, like a few months ahead of hosting World Cup for soccer. And I was really shocked when I saw that news. Like, why would you do that? Why would you risk narco-terrorism in states that you don't have a lot of control over? And then when more information trickled out on Monday that it was U.S. intelligence that had supplied the location of El Mancho, they literally tracked his lover to find him. Something out of a movie. But, and then you think about how, Mexico is being accused of not doing enough to stop fentanyl traffic across the border. And then, with this strike, you sort of have a card to play. You're like, well, Mexican troops can do it. They're taking it seriously. We had this thing that we did, but it's still such a huge risk to do that ahead of, global attention coming to your country.
Yeah, I think you just answered your own question about why, right? Like, pressure from the United States. You've got Kuzma on the table, potential separation trade things, United States, the Trump administration pushing for more and more. And, if those matches in Guadalajara have to be moved to the United States, I guess that's just too bad out of the whole thing, right? But there could be a lot wider play going on here when it comes to that. But look, obviously it's a tense situation and not great if you're a tourist on the ground there. I'm glad to see things are subsiding. The main thing, having some experience in consular efforts is you ultimately are responsible for your own safety and security where you're traveling on the ground internationally, not the government of Canada. The government of Canada does have a right to keep you informed, responsibility to keep you informed and provide information and try to direct you to the right places. But the government of Canada does not have a responsibility to evacuate you anytime 24/7. And there are some legendary stories about people's consular requests over the year. In fact, the Canadian government, when I was there, we started doing this at Christmas time. We published the top 10 best stories of people demanding service from the government of Canada, including there was one story of a woman who called and her son had been arrested and was in Italian jail for drug trafficking, convicted drug trafficking, and wondering if the government of Canada could do anything to break him out. So, these are some of the questions that the consular staff gets.
Did we say,
have a lot of sympathy through
I assume the answer was yes.
Thank you, Garry.
Well, listen, Gary's right. Like when you travel places, it is your responsibility. But I would say that, and we heard Minister Anand kind of come out and say that we weren't given a heads up and all that. Mexico, on a good day, you travel with caution, right? I remember when we were in government and we would go down to Mexico, we would have to take armed guard, like actual armed officers with us because anything is possible, right? Anything is possible. Listen, Mexico is known for a lot, but I think it's known most for basically being run by a bunch of narco thugs. And for the longest time, the government there has had to work around them, right? Even when you're trying to do business down. I remember when I worked in the energy sector and we were trying to build pipelines down in Mexico, it was a culture shock for the company because one of the first things that comes up when you get into certain communities is how do you buy, right? Because the cartel controls everything. So this is the truth. This is like the actual reality down in Mexico, and you have to figure out what to do. But it's obviously scary. Like anyone who watched the footage, like it's kind of terrifying. Like if you're at a resort and all of a sudden you're seeing like people pulling up onto the shores and like there's gunshot fires here and there. So like, yes, it is your responsibility to get back. But at the same time, this to me seems like, and we've alluded to this, there seems to maybe be a bigger play here that is not that obvious to mainstream just yet. But the US doesn't do anything just for the sake of doing it these days, right? There's always an agenda. So whether this is playing into that, I wouldn't be surprised if it is.
Well, look, you see the head of FIFA coming out saying they're considering a move today. I think it's something you have to take fairly seriously when the stadium you're looking at playing in discovered 450 some bodies. It was a mass dumping spot for cartels over the years. Like, is there a bigger move here? Probably, but I think they actually have to take a real look at this. And hey, it doesn't mean you can't have more matches in Canada too, Gary. At the end of the day,
I was
the
thinking,
winner
I'm pretty sure
of FIFA's inaugural Peace Prize is on it.
Well, I was going to say, their FBI director clearly seems seized by the matter once he pulls himself from his drunken stupor in Italy and gets over here. But yeah, I was thinking, I'm like, we should have more games in Canada, but I'm pretty sure there's only one stadium that's not hosting games that could be capable of it, and that I think is in beautiful Edmonton, Commonwealth. Probably could be the only one that has the capacity. I think that's all the topics we have for today. So I'll let everyone get in some final thoughts. Just something either you're looking forward to in the coming days or weeks, or something maybe in the past week that caught your attention that maybe didn't get as broad attention as you'd like. I'll start with you, Brian.
Well, for me, it's a no-brainer. I have to give props to Team Homan and our own Emma Miskew here, who works with us at iPolitics from time to time. Congratulations. Amazing story. They got down 1-3, and all the people that were haters over the last couple of years at all their success started coming out of the woodwork, and then they rattled off 5 in a row. Tough loss to Sweden in the semis, regrouped, and won a bronze medal for Canada. Congratulations. It's such a great showing, and it's something that I know made my daughter very proud as she was getting up in the morning to catch every single one of the games to watch her favorite curlers. But this is what the Olympics is about, inspiring young athletes to the sport, and Team Homan and Emma Miskew definitely stood out and did an amazing job when they did that.
How about you, Sharan?
Okay, something that I'm you just gave a really nice, thoughtful one about a colleague. I'm going to say the thing that I'm going to be looking out for this year, and I don't think we're talking about it enough, is what's going to happen in Quebec with the election, because everyone right now is really focused on what's happening with the feds around majority and how many seats do you need. But I don't think folks are tuned into enough what type of vote the Bloc is going to have federally. If the PQ comes in and steals the province, the Bloc federally doesn't have any reason to not do the same to increase their seat count in Quebec, right? They have one mandate, and their mandate is to represent Quebec. And I think that as much as we are focused on floor crossers and people coming over, and maybe there's not going to be an election if they get a majority, but I think Yves Blanchette's got a lot of power this year, depending on what happens in Quebec. And I think people need to watch what's going on out there really carefully.
And yeah, PQ just won their first consecutive by-election on Monday, so
there you go.
Got the momentum. How about you, Gary? What are your thoughts?
Well, I know while Brian's taking partial credit for that bronze medal in curling, a couple of things I'm watching this week. One, on Thursday, Pierre Poilievre was giving a speech in Toronto to the Economic Club on his view of Canada-U.S. relations. Obviously interesting in the wake of Jamil Jilani's recent trip to Washington and how he handled that, and what he'll lay out coming down the pipe. But secondly, the other story I'm watching, Alexandre Boulerice, the NDP's lone Quebec federal member of parliament, is openly musing about running in a provincial by-election in Quebec before the next election here. If he goes, that would mean that there were 4 vacancies in the House of Commons, all winnable by the Liberals, and to the point where I actually don't think we are risking a general election. I think we're more risking a situation where Mark Carney says we're going to have 4 by-elections on the same day, and the choice is between a majority or a minority government, between stability and chaos, and have all those by-elections on one day this spring or late spring, and try to get his majority that way. I'm not saying he's going to get it, but he could try to get his majority that way. Much easier to hold 4 by-elections on the same day and try to get it, rather than call a general election and all the chaos that entails. So that's Boulerice's decision will have an impact on whether there's 3 or 4 by-elections in the very near future.
I hope that happens just for pure entertainment purposes. Hey, what about you?
Yeah, just what Garry just said. That would be such an efficient way to do it. 4 in the same day. It would be, even taxpayer-wise.
Isn't that the obvious way to do it, guys? Really? That's what I would. Wouldn't anyone just do that?
Absolutely.
Well,
yeah.
Fred Delory made an interesting point from a spending point of view. If you hold multiple by-elections on the same day, you can lump all the fundraising limit together. They're not going to need to spend a lot of money in University Rosedale or Scarborough. They could pump all that money into Terrebonne and the other Quebec riding, whereas the Bloc would only be able to do it in 1 or 2 ridings. So they would have a spending advantage there.
Interesting.
Very interesting. What I'm keeping in the eye, I think it's, we're only in February, but 2026 has been so good to Canada on the internet. There was heated rivalry in January, and then this curling double touch controversy in February and all the memes that came out of that. And I have friends from across the world messaging me and like joking about it. And I think it's just so great that there's a spotlight on our country, you know, amid tensions with the US and a bit of hardship, and people can laugh and make jokes. And especially one of the TikTok trends I really love is I'm Canadian, and then someone's going around and they're like touching an appliance and they're just touching it again. And like, it's just so funny how a small moment has, you know, snowballed on the internet.
Love that. The Canadian century is here. I think the thing I'm looking forward to, and I'm going to turn into a bit of a rant, so you guys will have to stop me, is I think one thing that we forgot before Jeneroux made the move and kind of stole this media spotlight was Pierre Poilievre was put in a difficult position with Jamal Giovanni saying Canadians were throwing a hissy fit over the latest trade dispute. And I think Poilievre was very clear and, you know, respectfully denouncing that, saying Canadians have legitimate concerns with what Donald Trump is saying. But at the same time, you know, saying Mill can have his opinion, but I speak for the party. And I think it's important because I'm very curious, and Garry and Brian, I'm sure you guys can educate me on whether this is actual real presence in the Conservative Party, but there definitely seems to be some movement, some idea, some followers on that wing of our, or that part of our ideological spectrum who seem to be annoyed by Canada being pissed off at the Americans. And I don't know if it's just because Donald Trump and the Republicans are in power and they're conservative and they share similar ideological viewpoints, or if they do actually believe that Canadians are being overly reactive or throwing a hissy fit. And I think it's really going to be difficult for Pierre Poilievre to manage that because, yeah, I think there's some people in the Conservative Party, definitely not as big as numbers in the other parties, who maybe do like Donald Trump, who maybe sympathize with him and his convictions on some point, and it does kind of cloud their perception. There's a very specific type of person online, I don't know if they exist in the real world, who does like to talk about how Canadians are overreacting, how it makes us look small and weak, the fact that we care. But I think it's totally a reasonable reaction to someone saying your country doesn't matter, that it's a creation or it's allowed to exist simply by U.S. largesse, by American subsidies. You know, this is someone who didn't just say, we disagree on how we're taxing or how your tariffs are put in place. They're basically saying your country is ripping us off. You guys are scamming us. You guys only exist because we allow you to. So how are Canadians supposed to respond? So I think Pierre, you know, shut down any dispute of that in terms of putting Jamal Giovanni's comments in the right context, saying that Jamal's speaking for himself, not me. But I do wonder if that is going to be a problem for the conservative movement. How do you deal with those people who, whether openly or quietly, do sympathize with Donald Trump and do seem to not like the fact that Pierre or others in that movement attacking Donald Trump in the wake of what we're seeing in terms of this trade dispute? So I'm very curious to see how that plays out.
Well, I'm not the one calling Donald Trump an honest broker and transformational. That's Prime Minister Mark Carney who's calling this thing. And so, like, let's take a step back here. The other reality is, no matter how much Donald Trump may anger us with his rhetoric, the trade relationship between our two countries, which we're trying to preserve through CUSMA negotiations as we speak, and not trying to have unilateral deals, to have multilateral deals, is really, really important here. And so, yes, we can be angry about what Donald Trump is saying and his acolytes are saying about Canada, but the reality is that in order to shift our trade as much as Mark Carney has laid out that we need to trade, is going to take years and years of effort to do. It's not something that can be done overnight. And at the end of the day, the United States, in a lot of ways, will still remain our largest trading partner. So let's have a little bit of realism and realpolitik in this discussion. And as Stephen Harper, during the week of his 20th anniversary in government, said, let's put policy ahead of emotion. And I agree 100%. With Mr.
But it did seem like Mr. Harper did say, you know, he certainly does not belong to that part of the party or the view or the ideology, saying we should be able to withstand, or we should, you know, put up with some sacrifices to defend our country. He was talking about tit for tat, you know, retaliatory tariffs. So is that, like, I'm just genuinely curious, is this an actual dispute that's going on within the Conservative Party or within the broader conservative movement in Canada, with some people, you know, Stephen Harper and Pierre Poilievre on one side saying, we got to punch back, and other people maybe saying, you know, we kind of like Donald Trump. Maybe let's not take that same approach that Mark Carney's doing.
I don't think that this is about Donald Trump as much, or if I'm being honest, I don't think it's just the Conservative Party of Canada. I think that's what people try to at times lump it into. At the end of the day, I have heard both conservatives and liberals strongly state what Garry has just said, which is the reality is, at the end of this 4 years of Donald Trump, no matter what, the United States of America is going to be our largest trading partner. And the message that I took away from Prime Minister Harper and Prime Minister Carney's speeches 2 weeks ago was we as Canadians need to stop trying to divide, especially Harper pointed out the two parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, need to work together right now to bring the country together, to focus on policies that need to be enacted to get us through this stronger, that are going to be painful now in the short term, but give us an opportunity to get through this stronger as a country in the long term. And I think that's the important message to take away from it. And the fact of the matter is there's people on both sides that can be pointed out to the extremities of this. The Trump policies, and I've said this before, is the next president of the United States, Democrat or Republican, Gavin Newsom or otherwise, going to walk in and say, we don't want those auto manufacturing jobs in Michigan. Let's do something good for the Canadians. So we need to take a more responsible approach to this as Canadians, as Conservatives, as Liberals, and put the country first and move together with some solid policy. And I would just finish it by saying, if I went to Washington as a member of Parliament without telling the whip's office, Gary Keller would have been the first one yelling and screaming at me. So, I don't know.
You're where?
Yeah.
You're where?
The flight is canceled.
I think, Sharan, did anyone want to share any final thoughts? Thank you all for joining us. It was a terrific show as always. Thank you, Sharan, Garry, and Aya, and Brian, of course, for serving as my reliable co-host. Thanks to all our listeners and our viewers. We'll be back same time next week. Thanks so much. Have a great one.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.